X-Men, written by Tim Maxwell, based on an unproduced film proposal. The story outline was written by the duo Pete and Anna and dated May 27, 1982. Chapter 1. The Fractured Team. The room was still, except for the occasional flicker of the holographic monitor mounted at the front of the luxurious boardroom. The soft hum of Xavier's massive computer filled the air as the X-Men sat around a polished oak table, their eyes fixed on the image on screen. The sprawling walls, lined with books and mementos from battles past, only heightened the tension as William Bishop's voice boomed through the speakers. He was the face of the anti-mutant movement. Tall, clean-cut, with sharp, authoritative features and an ever-penetrating stare, Bishop spoke with a charismatic venom that had captured the hearts of many. His interview, broadcast to millions, painted mutants as the ultimate threat to human society. Mutants, he was saying, are inherently dangerous, their powers unpredictable, their loyalties questionable. The very existence of these people puts every ordinary citizen at risk. A faint chuckle escaped from Beast, seated at the far end of the table. He leaned back in his chair, pushing up his glasses as if to underline the absurdity of Bishop's statements. "Ironic, considering the good we've done," he whispered, too low for most to hear. Storm, regal and silent beside him, smirked, but said nothing. The others didn't even flinch. On the screen, Bishop continued, "And it is our duty to ensure that these mutants are properly contained, for the safety of everyone." A moment later, the screen blinked off as the door at the back of the room slid open. The quiet creak of a wheelchair rolling across the room announced the arrival of Professor Charles Xavier. His mere presence commanded attention, and every member of the X-Men turned toward him as he came to a halt at the head of the table. His expression was unreadable, but there was a heaviness in his eyes, a weight that hadn't been there before. "We have a problem," Professor X began, his voice calm, but carrying an undercurrent of something deeper, more troubling. "There has been a drastic increase in violence and crime around the world. Mutant-related incidents. Something unknown is driving this surge." Beast raised an eyebrow. "Well, with a little overtime, I'm sure we can manage it," he quipped, attempting to lighten the mood. The professor's gaze snapped toward him, and his tone became uncharacteristically sharp. "This is no laughing matter, Hank. This isn't about simply managing the situation." His voice cut through the room, and everyone fell silent, Beast included. I didn't form this team so you could respond to problems on a case-by-case basis. You are not yet a team in the true sense of the word. You do not function as a unit, and that makes you vulnerable." Wolverine, who had been sitting with his arms crossed, glowered at the floor, but said nothing. Jean Grey sat beside him, her brow furrowed in quiet thought, though her eyes occasionally darted in Logan's direction. "We're doing our best, Charles," Cyclops finally said. His voice was measured, but there was a tension beneath it. "You know how much pressure we're under. Bishop and his followers are watching our every move, looking for any reason to discredit us." "I'm aware," Professor X replied, his voice softening slightly. "But that is precisely the problem. You're too concerned with what's outside this room, with the criticisms, with the accusations. None of that matters if you can't deal with the conflicts within yourselves, within this team." His words hung heavily in the air, and for a brief moment, his gaze lingered on Wolverine and Jean. There was an unspoken message, a tension between them that went beyond missions and powers. But before anyone could respond, the room was interrupted by the shrill tone of an alarm. The monitor flickered back on, revealing a live feed from downtown Manhattan. The scene was pure chaos, streets ablaze, overturned cars, panicked civilians fleeing in every direction. "It seems we're needed," Cyclops said, rising from his seat. The rest of the team moved in unison, all too eager to escape the heavy atmosphere of the boardroom and Xavier's increasingly stern reproach. Yet, as Cyclops reached for the door, Xavier called after him, his voice carrying a note of finality. "Remember, Scott," Xavier said softly, his gaze locked onto the team leader. "Your strength lies in your ability to work together. If you don't, all of this could come crashing down." Cyclops nodded, but said nothing as the team rushed out of the room. Alone once more, Xavier let out a deep sigh. His expression darkened with concern, as if he hadn't told them the full truth. He turned back to his computer, his fingers hovering over the keyboard. "Cerebro," he commanded. "Run a global analysis of recent incidents. Compare for any patterns, no matter how small." As data scrolled across the screen, Xavier's frown deepened. Something was building, something bigger than any of them had faced before, and it felt as though it was aimed directly at the X-Men. His mind wrestled with the implications. "There's only one place left to search," Xavier whispered to himself, his thoughts drifting toward the astral plane, a realm he dreaded visiting now more than ever. If the answer lay there, it was more serious than he'd imagined. Back in Midtown, the X-Men arrived to a scene of utter destruction. Fire raged through the city streets, and terrified citizens huddled in the corners of buildings, praying for rescue. Without a word, they sprang into action. Storms soared into the air, calling forth dark clouds and torrential rain to douse the flames. Iceman moved next, coating the ground with a sheet of ice to prevent the fire from spreading. Cyclops fired precision blasts of energy at the burning debris, clearing pathways for trapped civilians. But, as the team worked seamlessly, a sudden surge of chaos broke their rhythm. Wolverine, spotting an enemy mutant, launched himself into pursuit. His claws extended, a growl escaping his throat as he closed in on the fleeing villain. Yet, just as he was about to strike, a cry caught his attention. Jean was in trouble, pinned beneath a crumbling wall. Logan halted, torn between the chase and saving his teammate. But before he could make a decision, Jean's telekinetic energy flared to life, effortlessly lifting the debris from her. She was safe, and the villain had escaped. The sound of sirens blared as police arrived on the scene, and soon Angry shouts filled the air. "Mutants! Look at the destruction they've caused!" one man yelled. Another chimed in, "They're worse than the criminals!" Wolverine growled under his breath, his fists clenching, but Cyclops signaled for the team to retreat. It was clear their presence wasn't welcome. As the X-Men withdrew, far from the chaos, Professor X sat in silence, staring at the computer screen. The search had come up empty. If there was a pattern to the violence, it was beyond even Cerebro's detection. "There's only one place left," Xavier muttered. "The astral plane." His hands trembled slightly as he prepared to leave his body behind, to search in the one place he feared most. On the screen beside him, William Bishop's voice rang out once more, this time live from the very scene the X-Men had just fled. "This is exactly why we cannot trust mutants. They bring destruction, even when they claim to help." Bishop's words, laced with malice, reverberated across the airwaves. In the X-Mansion's rec room, the X-Men watched Bishop's broadcast in growing frustration. Logan snarled and kicked the monitor across the room, shattering it into pieces. "Enough!" Cyclops barked, stepping between Wolverine and the remnants of the screen. But the damage was done. Beneath the surface, the fractures within the team were growing. Chapter 2. Unbearable Strain. The sun had barely risen over the grounds of Xavier's School for Gifted Youngsters, casting long golden beams through the sprawling gardens and hallways. Inside, the X-Men were scattered across the mansion, each enjoying the rare reprieve from the chaos of the day before. It seemed, at least on the surface, that the tension and turmoil of the previous day had been set aside. Beast, ever the playful intellectual, was engaged in a lively back and forth with Storm in the common room. He dangled upside down from a chandelier, his large blue hands swinging a book to illustrate a particularly dramatic point. "You see, Aurora, when considering the physics of flight, the humble bumblebee truly defies explanation. Yet here we are, watching them buzz about, oblivious to the laws of nature." Storm laughed, her silver hair catching the sunlight as she watched her friend with bemused amusement. "Hank, only you could make a conversation about bees this entertaining." Beast grinned, flipping down from the chandelier to land gracefully on the floor. "It's a gift." Cyclops, leaning against the doorframe, couldn't help but smirk at their antics. He had always admired how Beast and Storm could lighten the mood, even after a day like yesterday. And they needed it. The looming threat of William Bishop and the anti-mutant movement had cast a long shadow over the team. But not everyone was so at ease. Jean Grey stood by the window, her arms folded, watching the grounds but seeing nothing. Her mind was elsewhere, on the professor. Even as her teammates laughed, her concern lingered, an invisible weight pressing down on her chest. She had sensed something last night, something off about Xavier's departure into the astral plane. He was in danger. She was sure of it. Suddenly, a sharp pulse jolted through her mind. Jean gasped, her hand instinctively clutching her forehead. It wasn't just a premonition. It was him. He's back. She turned abruptly, her voice urgent. "The professor? He's back." The room stilled. Beast and Storm exchanged concerned glances before everyone rushed toward the entrance hall. Jean was already halfway there, her pace quickening with each step. When they arrived, they found Charles Xavier slumped in his wheelchair, pale and exhausted, his normally sharp eyes clouded with fatigue. "Professor!" Cyclops rushed to his side, kneeling beside him. Jean hovered just behind, her heart racing. She could feel his mental strain, the raw psychic energy barely contained beneath the surface. Xavier weakly raised a hand, signaling them to stop fussing over him. I'm fine. I just need a moment. You're not fine, Jean insisted, her voice trembling slightly. You shouldn't have pushed yourself like that. I had to, Xavier rasped, struggling to focus. His gaze drifted across the room, settling on each of them as he spoke. I found something far worse than I imagined. Cyclops stood, his expression hardening. What did you find? Xavier took a shallow breath before speaking, his words weighed down by the enormity of what he was about to reveal. In the astral plane, I encountered a creature, a being feeding on the chaos and violence spreading across the world. It's not just random acts of aggression. This monster has been creating negative energy, fueling conflict for its own survival. The room fell silent, the gravity of his words sinking in. That's what's behind the surge in crime, Jean said, piecing it together. And the anti-mutant hatred. Xavier nodded, but his strength was waning. His eyelids fluttered, and before he could continue, his head lolled forward as he fell unconscious, his body slumping deeper into the chair. Professor! Jean cried, rushing to his side. Cyclops grabbed Xavier's shoulders, trying to rouse him, but it was no use. He's out cold, Cyclops said, his tone laced with frustration. We need to get him to bed. Jean bit her lip, feeling the professor's strained mind slipping further away. She exchanged a glance with Cyclops, who nodded in agreement, and together they wheeled him toward his quarters. Later, the X-Men gathered in the briefing room, the weight of Xavier's revelations pressing down on them all. The professor was stable, resting for now, but the implications of his discovery were grim. This creature in the astral plane, Beast mused, pacing back and forth. It's the source of all this madness. Bishop's movement, the riots, the violence. But how do we fight something we can't even touch? Storm asked, her calm voice barely masking her concern. It's in the astral plane. If we go after it there, we might never come back. That's what makes this so dangerous, Cyclops said, standing at the head of the table. The professor is right. This thing is feeding off the fear and chaos, and if we don't stop it, it'll get worse. Jean sat quietly, her fingers absent-mindedly tracing patterns on the table. Her connection with Xavier had been faint while he was in the astral plane, but the glimpses she had caught were terrifying. The sheer presence of the creature was overwhelming, and its influence seemed to stretch across the entire plane. She could still feel its dark tendrils lingering in her mind. Suddenly, the door opened, and to everyone's surprise, Xavier wheeled into the room, looking slightly more composed, but still far from fully recovered. You should be resting, Jean said, rising to meet him, concern etched in her features. Xavier waved her off. There's no time. I must go back into the astral plane. That creature, it's growing stronger. If I don't stop it now, we won't stand a chance. Cyclops frowned. Can't we come with you? We've fought on the astral plane before. The professor shook his head, his expression grave. No, it's too dangerous. The astral plane is unlike anything you've faced. You could easily become trapped, and if you do, there's no guarantee you'll return to your bodies. We can't just sit here while you risk everything alone, Cyclops protested. I know, Xavier said, his voice softening. But I have to do this. You must stay here and handle the situation in the physical world. Bishop's followers are growing more aggressive. I fear they may attack the school while I'm away. The room fell into a heavy silence. Each X-Man wrestled with the impossible decision laid before them. Jean's heart sank as she realized the weight of what Xavier was asking. What if he doesn't come back? She knew the dangers of the astral plane better than anyone, and the thought of the professor facing that creature alone chilled her. "I'll maintain contact with you, Professor," Jean finally said, her voice trembling slightly. "I'll be your anchor." Xavier smiled faintly. "Thank you, Jean. But be careful. The strain could be unbearable." As the professor prepared to leave his body once again, the tension in the room was palpable. The X-Men watched as his eyes closed, his body going limp as his consciousness slipped away. This time, they could feel the weight of the danger more keenly. Jean's brow furrowed in concentration as she extended her mind, following him into the astral plane. The world around Xavier dissolved into the swirling, surreal landscape of the astral plane. Colors bled into one another, and the ground shifted beneath him like liquid. In the distance, he could sense it, the creature, lurking in the shadows, its malevolent energy permeating everything. As he moved forward, the plane itself seemed to resist him. Nightmarish shapes materialized, trying to bar his way, illusions meant to break his will. Xavier pushed through them, his mind focused, determined. But the deeper he ventured, the more oppressive the creature's presence became. He could feel it watching him, toying with him. Finally, he saw it. An amorphous, dark figure, pulsating with raw, negative energy. The creature's form shifted and writhed, as if it were made of the very chaos it fed upon. Xavier approached cautiously, knowing that this was only the beginning. The real battle was yet to come. Back at the school, Cyclops sat at the professor's computer, monitoring outbreaks of violence in the city. Bishop's influence was spreading, and anti-mutant mobs were growing more dangerous by the hour. "Dispatch teams!" Cyclops ordered over the comms. "Be careful, and don't engage with the mobs. They're not our enemies." Jean remained by Xavier's side, her body trembling as the strain of maintaining their psychic link took its toll. Cyclops glanced at her, worry etched into his features. But before he could voice his concerns, Jean's body convulsed, and with a scream, she collapsed, unconscious. Cyclops rushed to her, cradling her limp form in his arms. A cheer erupted from the monitor, drawing his attention. On screen, William Bishop stood at the head of a massive rally, his voice ringing out with triumphant malice. "This is why we must rid ourselves of the mutant menace," Bishop shouted, his crowd roaring in agreement. "The time has come to destroy them." Cyclops's face darkened. He had no choice now. The professor was lost in the astral plane, and Jean couldn't help him. They had to act. As the rest of the X-Men returned from their missions, Cyclops explained the situation. "We have to go into the astral plane ourselves. If we don't stop that monster, everything we've fought for will be destroyed." The team exchanged uneasy glances. The risks were immense, but they knew Cyclops was right. Jean, groggy but conscious once again, sat up and shook her head. "It's too dangerous, Scott. I might be able to get you there, but I can't guarantee I can bring you back." Cyclops placed a hand on her shoulder. "We have no other choice." The decision weighed heavily on them all, but in the end, they knew what had to be done. With a deep breath, Cyclops looked to his team. "Let's go. It's time to end this." As Jean prepared to guide them into the astral plane, the weight of their mission settled over them. This battle would decide everything, whether they could save the professor, stop the creature, and protect the world they had sworn to defend. Chapter 3. X-Men United. Jean Grey stood at the center of the room, her hands trembling as she stared at the faces of her fellow X-Men. They had all made the decision to enter the astral plane to face the monster that had been tormenting their world. But the burden rested on her shoulders. The others looked to her for strength, trusting her to guide them into a place that few could survive. "Are you sure you can do this?" Cyclops asked, his voice low but steady. Jean swallowed hard, the weight of their lives pressing down on her. "I'm not sure of anything, Scott," she admitted. "I can get us there. But bringing us back—" Her voice trailed off, the uncertainty looming between them like a dark cloud. She felt the responsibility crushing her. If she failed, they would all be trapped in the astral plane, their minds forever lost. Silence filled the room. Each X-Man, Beast, Storm, Wolverine, and Cyclops, stared at her, their expressions resolute. They had all fought side by side for years, and this moment, more than any other, demanded trust. Trust in Jean, in each other, and in their ability to face the unknown together. Finally, Jean nodded. "Okay," she said, her voice firmer than she felt. "Let's do this." The group gathered around her, standing in a tight circle. Jean closed her eyes, focusing her psychic energy. The air in the room seemed to hum with power as she reached out, her mind stretching beyond the physical world and into the vast, shifting currents of the astral plane. She could feel the pull, the strange gravity of that otherworldly dimension, beckoning them forward. In an instant, the world dissolved around them, and they were no longer in the mansion. The astral plane was a swirling, kaleidoscopic nightmare. Colors bled and twisted, shapes morphed and reformed in bizarre patterns. It was a world of endless possibility and infinite danger. The X-Men stood together in the dreamlike landscape, their bodies lighter, their senses heightened. But even in this alien realm, something felt wrong. There was a heaviness, a darkness that seemed to wrap around them like a shroud. Jean opened her eyes, her gaze sweeping across the vast expanse of the astral plane. "We're here." No sooner had she spoken than the ground beneath them began to shift and warp. The swirling mists parted, and a violent, disorienting force pulled them in different directions. "Jean!" Cyclops shouted, reaching for her, but his hand passed through empty air as he was dragged away, his body vanishing into the fog. One by one, the others were torn from each other's sight, their cries fading into the ether. Jean gasped, feeling herself yanked into the void. Her heart pounded as she realized they had been separated, isolated in the most dangerous place imaginable. Cyclops stumbled through the shifting terrain, his vision hazy, the landscape constantly changing around him. Every step seemed to carry him deeper into a personal nightmare. He found himself standing on a battlefield, surrounded by debris and destruction. But this was no ordinary fight. He recognized the charred remains of the city, the lifeless bodies of mutants strewn about. His worst fear, the failure of their cause, the destruction of everything the X-Men had fought for. "Scott Summers, the leader who couldn't lead," a voice whispered, cold and mocking. Cyclops spun around, but there was no one there, only the disembodied voice that echoed through the smoke. "You failed them. You failed her." "No!" Cyclops clenched his fists, trying to focus, but the images only grew more vivid, more real. He could see Jean's lifeless body among the ruins, her eyes empty, her hand outstretched toward him. Storm found herself in a stormy sky, lightning crashing all around her. But something was wrong. She was no longer in control. The winds howled. but they didn't respond to her will. The lightning lashed out, striking the ground with chaotic fury. She reached out, trying to calm the storm, but it roared back, defiant. Her worst fear, losing control, becoming a danger to those she sought to protect, had come to life. The storm intensified, pushing her back, knocking her out of the sky. For the first time, Aurora felt the sting of helplessness as the storm raged beyond her grasp, threatening to consume her. Wolverine, alone in a dark forest, faced the worst of all his demons. The trees around him closed in, and the familiar scent of blood filled the air. The shadows shifted, forming into figures he knew all too well, the people he had killed. His past, a blur of violence and tragedy, surrounded him. Their faces were accusatory, their voices haunting. "You're nothing but a weapon, Logan," one of the shadows hissed. "All you do is destroy. You'll never be more than the animal they made you." Wolverine growled, his claws extending, but as he struck at the shadows, they reformed, their faces even more haunting. His own self-loathing threatened to drown him as he relived every painful memory, every failure. Beast found himself back in a sterile laboratory, surrounded by glass cages and bright, unforgiving lights. But he wasn't the scientist here. He was the experiment. His body was shackled, his hands bound, and a group of cold, unfeeling eyes stared down at him through the glass. "A freak of nature," one of the scientists muttered. "Nothing more than a beast." Beast's heart raced as he struggled against the chains, but they only tightened. His mind screamed for reason, for logic, but in this twisted reality, none existed. He was nothing but the monster they saw, a creature whose intellect meant nothing in the face of his appearance. Jean was lost in a labyrinth, the walls closing in around her. But worse than the physical trap was the psychic one. She could feel the presence of the monster, an entity vast and malevolent, its influence permeating every corner of the astral plane. It whispered to her, its voice slithering through her mind like poison. "You brought them here, Jean," it hissed, "and now they'll never leave. You've doomed them all." Jean gritted her teeth, fighting the mental assault, but the doubt crept in. What if the monster was right? What if she had led her friends to their deaths? She had promised to bring them back, but here they were, each alone, each trapped in their own nightmares. And it was all her fault. The X-Men were losing. Each of them was trapped in a nightmare tailored to their deepest fears, and the monster knew exactly how to exploit those fears. It understood them with a frightening clarity, drawing on their weaknesses, their doubts. The more they struggled, the more powerful the monster became, feeding on their despair. But then, something changed. It started with Cyclops. As he stared at the ruins of the battlefield, the faces of his fallen comrades, something clicked. This isn't real. His mind fought against the illusion, the despair. This is the monster's trick. He couldn't let his fear control him. Not now. Not ever. At that moment, a wave of clarity washed over him. He remembered who he was, Scott Summers, leader of the X-Men, and his team was counting on him. His fear dissolved, and with it, the nightmare around him shattered. Across the astral plane, the same realization dawned on the others. Storm, with her heart pounding, stopped fighting the storm, and instead embraced it. I am the storm. She was not a victim of her power. She was its master. The winds answered her call, the lightning obeyed her command, and with a burst of energy, she broke free of the nightmare's grip. Wolverine, snarling at the shadows of his past, stopped running from them. "I am more than my past," he growled. "I'm an X-Man." With a roar, he tore through the illusions, the faces of his demons disintegrating into mist. Beast, his mind racing, found the strength to break free of his chains. "I am not defined by what I look like. I am defined by my mind, my heart." The cage shattered, and with it, the fear that had held him captive. And Jean, deep in the labyrinth, silenced the monster's voice. "This is my mind, my domain. You have no power here." With a mental scream, she tore through the psychic walls that had trapped her, breaking free into the open astral plane. As if drawn together by an invisible force, the X-Men reunited, their fears behind them. The monster, sensing its hold slipping, lashed out in a final desperate attempt to stop them. But now, the X-Men were united, stronger than they had ever been. Cyclops, Storm, Wolverine, Beast, and Jean stood together, their energies converging into one unstoppable force. They had faced their fears, and in doing so, had become the perfect team, a unity that no monster, no matter how powerful, could break. With a blinding flash of light, they attacked the creature as one. Their combined strength tore through the darkness, unraveling the monster's form. It writhed and twisted, its power dissipating as the X-Men overwhelmed it in a blaze of glory. The creature let out one final, ear-splitting screech before it disintegrated into nothingness. Back in the mansion, the X-Men awoke in their bodies just as the door to the room burst open. William Bishop and his mob surged inside, their faces twisted with hatred. But in that same instant, the mob stopped in their tracks, their expressions softening, confusion replacing rage. Professor Xavier, his mind free of the monster's influence, stood tall, his strength returned. He reached out telepathically, calming the storm of anger in the mob's minds. Slowly, the hate that had driven them dissolved, and peace returned. Bishop, no longer under the monster's sway, dropped his weapon, his eyes wide with realization. "What? What have I done?" he whispered, horrified. Professor Xavier addressed the room, his voice calm but powerful. "The monster used our fears against us. It exploited the divisions between us, the weaknesses of our hearts. But today, the X-Men proved that unity, trust in each other, is our greatest strength." The X-Men, still catching their breath, exchanged glances, knowing the truth in his words. "You all felt it, didn't you?" Cyclops asked, looking at his teammates. "That moment when we came together?" Jean nodded. "I thought it was the professor guiding us, but it wasn't. It was us." Professor Xavier smiled gently. "It was you. I was trapped, helpless, until you united. It wasn't my strength that defeated the monster. It was yours. Together." The room fell silent, the lesson sinking in. The X-Men had faced their worst fears and emerged victorious, not as individuals, but as a team. And that was their greatest power. Even William Bishop, standing in the ruins of his misguided movement, seemed to understand. The crowd outside slowly dispersed, their anger fading as they, too, realized the truth. The danger had passed, and the X-Men had saved the day, together. As the sun rose on a new day, the X-Men stood side by side, knowing that no matter what challenges awaited them, they would face them as one.